Hello, and welcome to Armenian News Network Groong. I'm 𝐏𝐚𝐫𝐭. Before we begin, I'd like to thank you for listening to and supporting our podcast. If you like what you hear, we'd appreciate your help in reaching a wider audience by subscribing to our channel, liking, and sharing our podcasts. We are available on most major media platforms, including YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, and more. In this multi-part conversation on Groong, 𝐓𝐻𝐵 explores Turkey's transformation throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, and the underlying dynamics powering these changes. Professor 𝐏𝐻𝐿 is a senior lecturer of political science and international relations at Bentley University in Massachusetts, where he teaches courses on the Middle East and the former Soviet space.
Hello and welcome. I'm 𝐓𝐻𝐵. In 2002, Turkish Justice and Development Party, the AKP, won a sweeping victory in the country's general elections, dominating and shaping domestic and foreign policies of Turkey for nearly 2 decades to this date. Outwardly, under Erdogan's and AKP's leadership, Turkey has transformed from a country with a stated and acclaimed foreign policy seeking zero problems with neighbors to one that is actively engaged in economic, political, and military rivalry with its Middle East and other regional neighbors, as well as balancing global players. Armenia is deeply affected by the quality of relationships that Turkey conducts with each of its neighbors. In the first part of our conversations on Groong about Turkey, we explored the topic continuity and change in political culture and foreign policy in Turkey, covering transition from Kemalism to Islamism as defined by the AKP. We look at how recent events fit together within the framework of continuous yet changing state policies. We also discuss Turkish foreign policy in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean. To cover these topics, joining me today are Professor Ara Sanjan, who is an associate professor of history and the director of the Armenian Research Center at the University of Michigan Dearborn. His research interests focus on the post-World War I history of Armenia, Turkey, and the Arab states of Western Asia. Professor Varujan Ghehamian, who is an assistant professor at Yerevan State University's Department of Oriental Studies, who teaches courses on Turkey's modern history, history of Azerbaijan, sociocultural anthropology of Azerbaijan, political ideologies and parties in modern Turkey, and history of the Turkish Republic. Diana Yayloyan, who is an Ankara-based research associate working on Armenian-Turkish normalization project supported by the EU. Diana is also a PhD candidate at the Middle East Technical University, focusing on gender theory and peace building. And last but not least, joining us is Professor Varam Ter-Matevosyan, who is an associate professor and chair of the Political Science and International Affairs program at AUA. His research interests focus on Turkish politics, Kemalism, political Islam, and security in the South Caucasus. Let's start the conversation by looking at how Turkey has transformed in the last couple of decades, if not more. For that, we're very much interested in listening and hearing about Turkish transformation from Ottomanism to Kemalism. And I would like to ask Ara Sanjan to give a couple of words about the overall transformation that Turkey witnessed.
I believe the issue was after the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, where, of course, Mustafa Kemal had to make a choice. And in that sense, he defined the Ottomanness, which for him to come to mean Turkishness, within largely the Asia Minor context, and gave up a lot of the Muslim populated parts of the Ottoman Empire, which had gradually become central to the empire after the War of 1877-1878. At that time, still in the Arab world, particularly among the Sunni population in the Arab world, there was still a lot of sympathy towards Turkey. And a lot of people did expect Kemal, after the conquest of Izmir, to continue towards, for example, Aleppo and move southwards. But that was a strategic choice which Kemal made, and his successors up until Erdogan actually observed, but basically distancing themselves from the internal problems of the Arab world. Of course, the Islamist current started growing in Turkey after the Constitution of 1961, which opened more space for political participation. And gradually, Necmettin Erbakan, of course, became more and more influential, actually forming a coalition government with Tansu Çiller, and then, of course, provoking that government show of force, when tanks basically forced the resignation of that government. And ultimately, it was for Erdogan to come to power. We all remember that he was banned from politics when his party won. So he had to wait for another 6 months or so in order to assume real power, not from behind the scenes. And ever since then, I think he has taken a new choice, a choice which has downgraded the application for EU membership into playing a much bigger role in what we call the Middle East and North Africa, in the former Muslim hinterland of the Ottoman Empire, and thus becoming a very strong having a very strong bargaining chip with the Europeans, a sense of Islamic Gamal Abdul Nasser, while Abdul Nasser was trying to play the same role in the Arab world. And I think this is where we see his interventionist policies all originating from.
It's quite interesting to make that analogy of Abdel Nasser, who always viewed himself as an African leader, a third world leader, Arab leader, and so on at several levels, which we'll talk about in a second when we talk about foreign policy. Vadam, what are your thoughts about? You studied Kemalism. What are your thoughts about the transition or transformation of Kemalism in Turkey from outright Kemalism until the rise of Islamist parties and until also, especially now that it has become, instead of becoming the dominant paradigm, it has become sort of the opposition or the secondary paradigm vis-a-vis the Islamist view?
Yes, for the last 80 years or so, Kemalism as a system of thought, as an ideology, went through enormous transformation. And not only Kemalism itself, but also its interpretations were shifting, contradictory, and contested for the last 80 decades or so. The Republican People's Party, which was a founding party, the founding party of the Republic of Turkey, had to constantly renew itself and its party ideology by seeking new direction. It was a constant process. In some cases, radical turns were undertaken, especially in 1931, in 1935, in 1947, in 1966. The Republican Congresses were known as Congresses of Radical Shifts. As in many instances, members of the ruling elite political party and opposition Armenian intellectuals adopted unique and peculiar interpretations of Kemalism, and which in turn produced constant disagreements among them over interpretations of Kemalism's core meaning. So Kemalism was constantly on the move. Kemalism was not static, and if we look at Kemalism in the 1930s, which is seen as an area of high Kemalism, and Kemalism of today, we see a tremendous transformation, both in the content, in the form, and in the shape of Kemalism. So
Kemalism was constantly being reinvented.
Reinvented and reintroduced, not only ideologically, not only in the party doctrines, so in the public space also. Kemalism was more than ideology. It was a social contract in Turkey. It also shaped and directed not only education, not only the public domain, but also a number of other areas in Turkey. So all in all, Kemalism has been and remains an important indicator of Turkey's transformation for the last 80 years or so.
It's fascinating that the prominent role and the position that Kemalism has in Turkey has been used and appropriated by so many different political groups in Turkey, be those Islamist, nationalist, leftist even, because at the end of the day, the founder of the republic is beyond reproach. He's beyond criticism. Of course, based on looking at what you both said, it's quite fascinating to see that transformation and evolution into that context. In that continuing on this, I want to also talk a bit more about the political culture. How has these changes, independently of Ataturk, Kemalism, but also related to it, how has the political culture in Turkey changed in the past decade or so? The past, let's say, 2 decades. Let's narrow the field a bit. How have those changes influenced Turkish policies domestically, minorities, in the issues of political parties, realignment of political parties, as well as externally foreign policy, which we will talk about a bit later. Within this context, I would like to ask Varujan your opinion about observing Turkey in the last, decade or so. How has the political culture, as it relates to these issues, changed?
Yeah, I would like to, in a way, continue what my colleagues already told, but to make one important, probably, to underline one important factor. It is that, in a way, the current leadership of Turkey is actually using the same tools and methodology which was actually invented during the Atatürk's time. And once I already used this, that Erdogan is actually the best admirer of Atatürk. He's using the same frames while changing. Okay, he's using the same meal, he's making the same meal, but with different sauce. This is actually the best. I think that this is actually the best way to describe what's happening currently in Turkey. His current leadership is reinventing history, which was back then in the 20s. He is still trying to bring kind of a revolution to Turkey, which is a counter-revolution to what Kemal was trying to do, but again, he's using just the same narratives while changing the negative to positive or vice versa. So in this way, we kind of see the continuation of the same traditions, not many different things. Of course, there are some different types of approaches to foreign policy. For example, there is more stress on what is called so-called Ottoman legacy, which has many descriptions and different, let's say, understanding by different parts of the elite, because we are currently witnessing, in a way, creation of a collective Erdogan. It is kind of a different parts, different groups in the elite, which are trying to make on behalf of Erdogan their own aspirations, their own understanding of politics, and their own understanding of the future of Turkey.
Is it possible to say that it is elite manufacturing rather than elite making?
Yeah, it is. It is actually elite manufacturing, and this is why we have so many similarities. And I don't want to see any break between any big contradiction between former Turkey and modern Turkey. One of the main factors is, which is also described by those who are extensively researching Turkey, it is that in many areas, the most prominent ingredient of the sauce for the current government is the so-called Ottoman culture legacy, which helps to construct all the needed ideologies or all the needed frames be it in foreign policy, like we are going into Syria. This is nothing else than just bringing back and protecting Ottoman legacy there, starting with Palestine up to Libya. And right now we see it in its best way. It can be even used to somehow protect Islamic values. Like this is traditional Turkish, which was broke down during the Kemalist era. So this and the last thing is that we a couple of days ago we witnessed the transformation of the museum into mosque. This was the bright example how it was described by the ruling elite. It was not something Islamic, actually. It was not described as something very Islamic. It was described, we are bringing back the history. We are bringing back the traditions, which were, they didn't mention the name of Atatürk, actually, but everybody knows that this is because of Atatürk.
Continuing on what Varujan said, Diana, you've been living in Turkey for a while now. Based on what Varujan said in terms of transformations and attitudes and ideas, how do you see those, or do you witness those in everyday life?
I'm glad that Professor Sanjan mentioned about the rising struggle between Islamists, especially after 50s, because usually it's been thought that it was Erdogan who brought this Islamism in Turkey. Actually, it started much earlier, and in especially 60s, there was a rising conflict between Islamists and secularists in Turkey, which was emphasized also by later 𝐏𝐚𝐫𝐭, the founding father of 𝐏𝐚𝐫𝐭 movement, which is national vision movement, which is one of the precedents of AKP party. And 𝐏𝐚𝐫𝐭 would always close his speeches by saying that he will convert the Hagia Sophia into the mosque. And this was done already in early 60s and 70s. And what is also sometimes being overlooked is that the domestic structural transformation in Turkey is also intertwined with the global transformation and the rise of global south, economic strengthening of the global south, and very importantly, it's also related to the organic issue of Turkey, which is the rise, political independent rise of Kurdish issue and Kurdish movement in the Middle East. So starting with the domestic changes, of course, we witnessed them. So I came to Turkey in 2012. It was a completely different place. The environment was much more free, and we would speak as in academic environment. We would to discuss very sensitive politics, Kurdish issue, Armenian issue, etc. And then with the 𝐏𝐸 movement in 2030, situation has dramatically changed. The AKP started becoming more authoritarian, and also especially with the breakdown of the peace Kurdish discussions, peace talks in 2015. This also affected to the rising securitization inside of Turkey, especially of non-Muslim minorities and Kurdish minorities. So especially Kurds started being again securitized, being seen as a threat within the country. And of course, this affected and this led to the rise of political arrest within the country and the general perception that Kurds, along with other minorities, are becoming a rising threat within the national security of the country. This was going hand in hand with the rising military rhetoric and military behavior of Turkey in the Middle East, especially if we closely follow what happened in Syria in 2016, when Kurds proclaimed I think in March 2016, when Kurds proclaimed Rojava Federation, and after that Turkey started its military operations in Syria. And the same is related to Iraq. And this also gives opportunity for Turkey to continuously securitize, so continually bring emergency situation within the country, which we observed for 3 years. We were living under emergency situation in Turkey. And this also led to the increased censorship on not only academia, but any kind of opposition to the government. And also this importantly led to the Islamization of Turkish oppositional parties, which were secularist 𝐏𝐸𝐵. The only genuine opposition today, I would definitely say, is HDP pro-Kurdish HDP party. And we also clearly saw this during the recent conversion of Hagia Sophia and the reaction that oppositional parties would give to the conversion of Hagia Sophia into the mosque. Only HDP party was against. And but some would accuse saying that 𝐏𝐸𝐵, the Kemalist party, became to also using Islamic discourse. They are also becoming similar to AKP. But in fact, I think this is a tactic of survival for political parties, because considering the rise of Islamic values within Turkey, the Republican Party is afraid that they will be associated with the old, much criticized secular and Kemalism before. That's why they have to use this tactic of survival and use the same terminology.
In the previous section, we talked about Turkey's transformation in the last couple of decades. We want to discuss now about Turkish foreign policy. And it's quite a large leap and change that it has witnessed in the last couple of decades as well, where it has been, we are witnessing the rise of Turkish involvement, not only in the immediate neighborhood, but also overseas. Adventures with troops and military intervention in countries as far as Libya, signing agreements with Niger in Africa. So one of the first things that I want to ask before jumping into specific relations actually is, what is the doctrine, or is there an articulated foreign policy doctrine that Turkey uses for its foreign policy? Or is it a specific foreign policy articulated by the mood of President Erdogan? Maybe Varam, you can start us off.
What happens in Turkish foreign policy is a matter of interest not only for politicians but also for many observers. It still remains unclear to many observers how to explain Turkey's radical turns and even manifestations of foreign policy shifts and twists. However, people who study Turkish history and Turkish foreign policy, what we see in Turkey is just the continuation of a number of policies that have been around in the 19th century and also in the beginning of the 20th century. So this is yet another proof that we are seeing the rise of Ottomanism in Turkey, and this is not just on ideological level but also on a very practical level. So Erdogan's foreign policy is not the structured foreign policy of Davutoğlu, where you could see a frame and the entire political institutions were trying to feed that frame. What we see today is quite opportunistic foreign policy that is very populist in essence. It's a populist foreign policy. If you see how Erdogan is building the foreign policy framework, it tries to bring as much resource as possible, try to invest in all imaginable and unimaginable places, and try to capitalize it when the time is right. And African foreign policy is a good manifestation of that. Or Turkish presence in any part of the world where there is Muslim minority, Muslim population, are manifestations how Erdogan positions himself as a savior of oppressed people, savior of oppressed Muslims. And this is just one side of Turkish foreign policy. The other side of Erdogan's foreign policy, which is trying to position Turkey as relevant to many parts of the world, especially in Africa. In Somalia, there is a Turkish military base, and Africa, which meant little for Turkey until beginning of 2000s. Now Africa has an important place in Turkish foreign policy. However, that came at an expense of more going away from Europe, away from NATO commitments that Turkey had. So we see a Turkish foreign policy that is quite unstructured, that is quite ambitious, that is quite also vague conceptually.
Is it a manifestation, Bahram, of Erdogan's mindset rather than an institutional foreign policy?
Yes, Erdogan has overinflated sense of relevance of Turkey in global affairs. So Turkey challenges even the structure of the UN. Turkey wants to see itself in the permanent member of the UN Security Council. Turkey wants to restructure the entire structure of the international order. Turkey wants to interfere in those places where nobody could think of Turkey behind any wild imagination that Turkey could any one day have any pretensions over that particular position. But yet we have Turkey, which is trying to press as hard as it could and as much as it could until there is a pushback from the other side. So this is a Turkish foreign policy of today.
Thank you, Bahram. Ara, one of your earlier works, your dissertation was on Turkey and its Arab neighbors. And obviously you studied Turkish foreign policy in that context. How do you see that transformation today? The larger, not just general Arab world, but in general, How has Turkish foreign policy changed now vis-a-vis 40, 50, 60 years ago? Has it become less institutional, more one-person sort of play?
I cannot say anything about how that policy is being framed and who is the dominant person or group which directs that policy from Ankara, but I can see what is the difference in the types of action that the Turkish government is ready to take in the Arab world. Uh, Prior to Erdogan, basically there was a mild support for the Palestinian issue within a broadly Islamic framework, but this was contrasted by, active military cooperation between the army and the Israeli military establishment, and that was at its height in the 1990s. In the meantime, the Turks had invested quite a lot and were using the opportunities of oil money from the Gulf in order to broaden their economic involvement in the Arab world. What has changed since then is that there is now a very rigid anti-Israeli, sometimes even we can say anti-Jewish rhetoric coming from Erdogan. Arabs do not know how to interpret this, from one Arab leader naming his newly born child Recep Tayyip Erdogan to others actually just considering this as just simple hypocrisy. There's a very divided response. But initially, when the Turkish government of Erdogan focused only on the Palestine issue, there was a lot of support and the broad Sunni and Shia Arab support toward what was expected from Erdogan. I think there was a naive view in the Arab world that basically Turkey was coming to help as a charity with no expectations except perhaps, some good reward in afterlife as good Muslims. But after the Syrian conflict, when the Arab world became divided. Of course, the larger part numerically of the states are with Saudi Arabia, but there is a rigid and resistant minority which basically rallied around the Bashar al-Assad regime, and it has now support not only from Iran, but to some extent, but also from Russia, and also basically from radicals and Shiite Arabs in Lebanon, in Iraq, etc. Now, of course, Turkey basically became hostage to its own position, with some people actually considering Turkey as an asset, considering Erdogan as a savior, and that's strong in some levels of the Sunni community in the region, and others, of course, considering him as a threat and basically likening him to a foreign invader or a foreign intruder into the Arab world in general. But even in the Sunni field, Turkey has its own rivals, and its relations are not excellent with Saudi Arabia. They're not excellent with the United Arab Emirates, who actually is following largely the Saudi Arabian line, and of course they are not good with Egypt. To some extent, Turkey is trying to compensate that with good relations with Qatar and trying to have an independent foothold of its own among the Sunni community in Lebanon. In general, that's very, very visible. And to some extent, it can also be interpreted, maybe vaguely, into the compared with the Muslim Brotherhood, Salafi fissure within the Arab world in general, but I believe that's a bit secondary when geopolitical interests get involved. This is where Turkey now stands within the context of the Arab politics and intra-Arab relations.
Right. It's fascinating, listening to both of you. It seems that Erdogan is becoming more and more synonymous, or he's trying to become more and more similar with Atatürk, as was mentioned earlier by Varujan. And this is basically, he views himself as a new Ghazi. And moreover, it has become obvious that more often than not, Turkey is using its military as a most important tool
for a foreign policy implementation.
Yeah, it's foreign. You say that he wants to continue the foreign policy of Atatürk. Yes and no.
No, that's not what I meant. But he wants to become like Atatürk and become a Ghazi.
Okay, again, let me disagree here. First of all, just the contrary. In the entire ideology of political Islamism in Turkey, in the Milli Görüş movement that I have an entire book about, published in 2008, I do discuss for them Atatürk is author of all ills of Islam in Turkey. Erdogan wants to supersede Atatürk. He wants to become. He is more fascinated by Abdülhamid II. He has gone beyond Atatürk. He sees himself as someone who has done more than Atatürk did. This is how he pictures himself in the popular discourse. In the beginning, it was not the case. When he started in 2010s, he was trying to position himself next to Atatürk. But in the foreign policy sense aspect, I would say that in the 1920s and 30s, the Turkish foreign policy was about peace at home, peace in the world formula, even though it sounds very peaceful, but it wasn't the peaceful Turkish foreign policy. At that time, Turkey tried to adjust its borders with Iraq, with Syria, with Iran, and at the same time, it got control of Alexandria Sancak. And all this happened despite the claims that Turkish foreign policy is peaceful. So for him, Atatürk, in his mind, is more than Atatürk. He has done more than Atatürk. Atatürk founded the state, but it was Erdogan who transformed the state. So this is how I would say it was Erdogan who brought Turkey back to its core values, which are nationalism and Islamism and conservative values that Atatürk took away from genuine Turkish nation.
Thank you for that, Bahram.
Asbet, can I add something if you want to
Absolutely,
put it or not?
absolutely.
So I think it's not only the military. I think we should not underestimate the power of the Turkish economy, the light industry, which is actually capturing a lot of markets in the Arab East. We should also not underestimate the Turkish pop culture, which is making a lot of inroads into Arab world through, Turkish serials, which are TV serials, which are dubbed into Arabic, and have a very wide following in the Arab world. The Turkish Mediterranean coast has also become a very important destination for tourism, and so in the life of the average, upper class bourgeois or the middle class, citizen in an Arab world, basically Turkey is now a presence, just as to some extent America was through Hollywood and other things, something which was not there maybe 20 years ago.
That concludes this conversation on Groong about Turkey. Be sure to tune in to our next episode, where we will continue on this topic and explore Turkey's foreign policy in the Caucasus. We look forward to your feedback, including suggestions for future conversation topics. Contact us on our website at groong.org, that's Groong, or on our Facebook page, ANN-Groong, or in our Facebook group, Groong-Armenian News Network. Special thanks to Laura Osborne for providing the music for our podcasts. I'm 𝐏𝐚𝐫𝐿. On behalf of everyone in this episode, I wish you a good week. Thank you for listening and talk to you soon.